Hey everybody, so it's Ashley again. I just wanted to come in and give an updated um, PowerPoint presentation because I realized that I went really in depth in the other one, and although it's a really, really interesting topic, I wanted you guys to be able to have pretty much like the condensed version. So we're just going to be talking about communication disorders. Overall communication disorders relate to any different type of way of communicating. So, speech, language, a lot of times they'll relate it to hearing, and it's the misarticulation of words to complete inability to use speech. So, if you can't form full sentences, if you stutter, things of that nature. So there's three different definitions associated with it. We have speech, language, and communication itself. So this is really important just to have a clear underlying understanding of what they mean by each. So speech refers specifically to the expressive production of sounds and includes an individual's articulation and fluency. So that's pretty straightforward, just how you articulate your words, what syllables and letters you enunciate, things of that nature, uh, tone, just any type of expressive wording. Then you have language, so that's the form or function. So, we have spoken word, I think of poetry. We have sign language, written language, pictures, I think of hieroglyphics. Um, and then also, they say one of the universal languages is a smile. So think about just different ways in which we can communicate with people without it necessarily being verbal. And then communication is just any verbal or nonverbal, intentional or unintentional behavior, or influence behavior for ideas or attitudes. So just interacting with somebody and getting a point across and having them understand where you're coming from. So, overall, a review of the population, it impacts or it affects children. It starts in childhood. For some people, it goes away or it dissipates over time, but for others, it transitions into adolescence and then into adulthood. So, it could affect them for their entire life. Um, the majority of the people that it affects, prevalence wise, is children between the ages of 3 and 17. And as of 2016, it was affecting nearly 1 in 12. As of 2018, according to Psychology Today, nearly 6 million children under the age of 18 have a speech or language disorder, but I believe that was globally. And then among children that have some type of speech or communication disorder, 34% of them between the ages of 3 and 10 have multiple communication disorders. So that's where we see some type of comorbidity within communication disorders themselves, while 25.4% of them are between age 11 to 17. So even though each of the disorders, there's four different types of communication disorders, and even though they each have their own criteria, some of the main characteristics are just not speaking at all, limited word choice or trouble grasping simple directions or naming objects. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then in terms of diversity, excuse me, it affects boys more than it affects girls, much more actually, almost 4%. And typically it impacts children, again, as we said, between ages of 3 to 17. It impacts them the most, but that doesn't mean that it can't impact other people, or people that had it as a child. Once they enter adulthood, it can still impact them. And then ethnicity and race. Black children, but specifically black boys, um, have a higher percentage rate of communication disorders than white or Hispanic children. In terms of the literature or the research that has been done, a lot of the treatment plans focus on just being aware of your child's developmental level, and having prevention and early intervention. And then when you work with them, really focusing on active stimulation. So, reading with them, correcting them. I know my nephew, he is 2 right now. He'll be 3 in May. And he will say something to me, Auntie, that's my apple juice, right? But he won't say it like that. So then I will try to be reinforctive or corrective and say, yes, that's your apple juice, just to try and get that stimulation going. And so research does say that just having individual or group oriented work helps. It doesn't necessarily focus on what does or doesn't. But a lot of the things that it does focus on is that children who seem to put forth some of the characteristics of a communication disorder will usually get sent to a speech language pathologist, and then they may do stimulating activities such as boosting phonological awareness skills, so using language to express more complex ideas, building vocabulary. So, really just working with them on different ways of communicating or on the communication method that they're struggling with, and then finding a stimulating activity for that. And then causes, as always, we have kind of like a nature versus nurture, biological, environmental. So a lot of times they say it may be exposure to poisons during pregnancy and even after, but there could also be gene problems and brain developmental problems. So, breaking it down, the first one is language disorder. The key characteristics for this one is that persistent difficulties in the acquisition and use of language across modalities. So, the different types, spoken word, verbal, stuff like that, due to deficits in comprehension of production. And then they have to hit those three things, or they include those three things: reduced vocabulary, limited sentence structure, and impairments in discourse. And then for all of them, you'll see an onset of symptoms is early, and that they're early and developmental, and that the difficulties are not attributed to something else. So for this one, it's hearing or other sensory impairment. You'll see as we go along, a lot of the things that are checked when it comes to communication disorders is hearing, because if their hearing is messed up in any way, that could have an impact on how they are accurately communicating. Um, and also for the development and course, a lot of them, they try not to diagnose it before the age of 4, because that's when children are really coming into themselves and they developmentally should be reaching certain levels. And so this, for each of these slides with them in particular, I go just a little bit more into the specific assessment that may be focused for that type of communication disorder, or the differential diagnoses that could pertain specifically to that one. But in terms of prognosis, this one is really important, that it's highly heritable. So if somebody in your family has it before, it's likely that a child could be impaired with this. Next, we have speech disorder. And this one is really classified by the fact that there's persistent difficulty with speech sound production that interferes with spatial intelligibility or prevents verbal communication of messages. And then that goes on to impact, effective communication and social participation, academic achievement, things of that nature. So, like I told you guys, my nephew, he would pronounce words wrong, or like apple juice, like ABB instead of APP. And so that's something that, we all just worked on him with, but just so that we can ensure that he is pronouncing things correctly and sounding things out properly and articulating it. And then you'll see with the development and course, it's really reflected by age, but that mastering speech sound production should be intelligible by age 3, and then pronounced accurately by age 7. So that's why it's just really important to know and understand your child's developmental levels. And then again, we have the breakdown for this one specifically. I just wanted to talk about, they have treatment as muscle strengthening, because a lot of times if the muscles in the face are not as strong as they should be, that could also have an impact on the individual's speech. So that's really important. The next one, we have childhood onset fluency disorder, which is also known as stuttering. This one is really important because a lot of people may not necessarily understand all of the aspects of it. So in terms of diagnosis, it's a disturbance in the normal fluency and time patterning of speech that are inappropriate for the individual's age and skills. They persist over time and are characterized by frequent and marked occurrences of one or more. So there has to be at least one. We have broken words, I skipped a few. Sound and syllable repetitions, sound prolongation, audible or silent blacking, circumlocutions, words pronounced with an excess of physical tension. So any of these, and then we've all heard somebody, even the cartoon characters, in Looney Tunes, we have the one character that's like I said and so they fall into one of these categories. And then specifically, this disturbances cause anxiety about speaking or limitations in effective communication. So that's how it can go on to impact people because they may then have anxiety about public speaking, going on stage, being in front of people because they know that they have this impairment or they're stuttering or can't necessarily get a word out. And so this development, it occurs by age 6 for 80 to 90% of those affected, but the age of onset is usually between 2 and 7. Specifically for this prognosis, it's 3 times, there's more than 3 times the risk in the general population among first degree biological relatives. And then again, there are specific assessments. Treatment style, there's 3 different types. So you have indirect counseling, direct, which is changing the child's speech in and of itself, and then operant, which really has to do with reinforcement and response contingency. And then they list some of the differential diagnoses. So for each of the disorders that fall under communication disorder, they have different differential diagnoses, basically because they're focusing on different things. So this one of them is Tourette's, which makes sense because of with Tourette's, they have the sudden impulses and sometimes they blurt out certain things or they might stutter or have trouble getting a word out, which could be confused with child onset fluency. And then lastly, we have social pragmatic. This one is characterized by persistent difficulties in the social use of verbal and nonverbal communication. But what's really important is that it's manifested in all of the following. So deficits in using communication for social purposes, such as greeting and sharing information in an appropriate manner. So I think in the other presentation, I used the example that you wouldn't just meet somebody for the first time and be like, oh, hey, how you doing? My name is Ashley, and I just went to the bathroom, or I just went poop or something. You wouldn't just randomly tell it to somebody, especially somebody you just met, because that's inappropriate. Impairment of the ability to change communication to match context of the needs of the listener. So if you're having a conversation, being able to pick up on the social cue that that person either has no idea what you're talking about or they're not interested, and then finding a way to switch it up. Difficulties following rules for conversation and storytelling. So, normally when you tell a story, you go in order, you tell the story or you add certain things based on other people's reactions. Or difficulties understanding what is not explicitly stated. So I talked about how I had a friend of mine that went to a funeral the other day, and she was very irritable and visibly annoyed. And then she didn't explicitly state that she was grieving or explicitly state that she was sad, but that's something I was able to pick up on. But somebody with this communication disorder may not. So then also there's deficits that result in functional limitations in effective communication, for social participation, relationships, academic achievement, anything that has a social aspect to it. And then again, the symptoms are not attributed to something else. And then with this one, it's rare among children under 4 because it's hard to understand an individual's personality or what they do or don't understand before that age. But by 4 to 5, most children have adequate speech, so they should be able to have a better understanding. Family history of autism definitely could be a prognosis factor, and that's also why autism happens to be one of the differential diagnoses. And with treatment, there's different modalities. So you have augmentative and alternative communication, computer-based and instruction, and video-based instruction. And then you have different options. So behavioral, peer-mediated or implemented, and social communication. And then lastly, as with all of them, we have unspecified communication disorders. Just stating briefly, I found it really interesting that the majority of this information I got from the DSM, but I did do further research, and a lot of the population characteristics, the age, the gender, the race, ethnicity, all of those things were not included in the DSM. So I found that slightly problematic. Especially because there are always cultural considerations. So, especially people that vary in cultural groups or they have English as a second language, children that are bilingual could have a different developmental pace. Um, People's religion or religious beliefs could play a role in, especially within their communication, but specifically in what's considered normal. And back in 1997, research showed that there needed to be an assessment that um, there needed to be something that provided assessment and treatment protocols that were culturally fair and effective. So that's something that we're still seeing being worked on today. And then just as assessment and treatment as a general statement as a whole, they all usually refer to speech language pathologists upon demonstration of these symptoms. And then they could also be referred to a psychiatrist. And usually one of those people will give them a full evaluation, which could include, tons of different types of specific testing, but really psychological testing of thinking abilities, psychometric testing, and again, as we talked about earlier, hearing testing. And then treatment, a lot of it isn't necessarily based on drugs or medication, but it's based on team and collaborative efforts between parents, teachers, mental health experts, anybody influential in the child's life, and working one on one or in group settings with that child, and then also stimulating them in different situations. So not just having stimulation at school, but also getting stimulated at home, reading to them regularly or with them regularly, speaking in shorter sentences, and correcting their grammar, like I said with my nephew. So now we have the case vignette. Jacob is an 8-year-old black boy who lives in a loving home and attends school regularly. Although he is extremely intelligent, his performance in school is stifled because of his inability to produce articulated sounds in his speech. His sentences often have words that are pronounced inaccurately. Just last week, he scored low on a test at school and was laughed at by other kids because his pronunciation of the sentence, "The green car is under the table," came out as "the yin car under la lavabo." Jacob may suffer from, and the answer would be speech disorder, and that's based off of the fact that even though he's smart, his performance in school is stifled because of his inability to produce articulated sounds. He has trouble, and so because of that, that impacts his school work and how well he does. And then you see that he scored low on a test, whatever type of test it was, he scored low, and then he was laughed at. So that's affecting him socially, because of his pronunciation. And then we see exactly the type of pronunciation that he was not able to articulate or enunciate the pronunciation of that sentence. So that's why it would be speech disorder. And these are my resources. So I hope that this condensed version helps, but please feel free, and I would definitely recommend watching the longer version because I definitely go more in depth, and it's a really interesting topic. Thanks, guys. Have a great day.